Hi guys, we're filming this from home since we're all quarantined in our homes basically, but I wanted to do a little review for the skeletal lab to kind of cut it down for you guys, something I would normally do in the class. Just don't feel right about giving you all those structures to learn. So I'm going to try to be very efficient with this. Another thing, I just put an announcement on both course sites. Everyone will have to take this at a certain time for right now. We're just going to have to do it that way. It's during your normal class hour. Now, if you are in the Biology 137 that has 2 sections and you have lab at 11 o'clock, you're going to have to take it at 9 o'clock on this first exam until I figure out how I can put them on there a different way. So I'm going to be very efficient with this. I'm going to have my wife kind of blow up the picture, and I'm going to point to each. I'm going through your picture file in the order it is in. So being that this is a recording, you can go back and watch this over and over if you want, but you can get your pictures in line the way they are in the actual file. So let's get started, and I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to expect on each and every picture. That will really help you. All right, are we ready? Let's do this. Now this might go out from time to time and I'll have to scroll on the mouse pad on my laptop. The first picture here, any picture that has a probe in it, if it has a probe in it, that is the only thing I'm going to ask you on that picture. And there's at least 2 of these, maybe 3 that have a probe in them. So this one is stuck into the optic foramen or optic canal. That you'll see that under the sphenoid bone on your list. Next, we have another probe. Sorry, I'm going to screw this up here, it looks like. Not used to this laptop. Okay, I'm going back, sorry. Okay. The next one also has a probe in it. It is lying in the mandibular fossa. The mandibular fossa is, if you look on your sheet, is part of the temporal bone. All I would ask is, what is the probe lying in? And you will say mandibular fossa on the test. You will write it out. One other thing on these tests, these are still going to be in the same format they are in class. They're PowerPoint. You'll need to get you a piece of paper. I'm going to step into the camera for a minute. You need to get you a piece of paper, number it 1 through 52, and write your answer down, just like you do in class, with the exception, after you're done, you will email me those answers. Again, email me those answers. You can take a picture of it, whatever you want to do. So back to these. The next image, sometimes I tell in the review, there's going to be 5 things on the bottom of the skull in this view. Total, when you look at this, sometimes you can study like that and say, hey, I only have 5 things to know on the bottom. This particular slide, I want to focus on this area right here, which is the hard palate. And the hard palate is composed, it should be on your list somewhere. It's composed of 4 different structures actually, but structures from 2 different bones. You have the palatine processes of the maxilla and the palatine bones. There's 2 palatine bones, 2 palatine processes. That's what makes up your hard palate. That's a good bonus question sometimes. I think you have something on that on your list as far as bone combinations. Okay, next structure, again, we have a probe sticking in it. This is the same picture that you saw. This is the first picture I showed you on this list of images. This is just blown up a little bigger. So this again is the optic foramen or optic canal. Again on the sphenoid bone. This one I normally a lot of times don't show in the actual lab, but I'll catch it in the review. But the front of the skull is thinner generally than the back of the skull, is narrower. So this is the posterior part of the skull. This is the anterior part. This structure, this would make this the frontal bone, and this structure over top of that is the coronal suture on the frontal bone, and you'll see that listed under the frontal bone. So if I ask you anything on this, it will probably be that suture, the coronal suture. All right, on to the next image. Okay, What I like to do in lab sometimes is, this is one of those times that we get a little kick out of this, but before I say anything, I'll ask the students, is this the front or the back of the skull? And people will be out there perplexed or giving me an odd look. Well, there's no eye sockets or no mouth here, so we know this is the back of the skull. And what you have is a couple different suture lines coming down. These jagged lines are the suture lines, like I just showed you, the coronal suture on the above the frontal bone. This one coming down is the sagittal suture, but that's not the one we're looking for here. This one coming kind of at a triangular shape is the lambdoid suture, and that's associated with the occipital bone. So if I want something on this one, it would be the lambdoid suture. Okay, now we have a slide. Now we have a picture that has several items here. We can show you, and I'm going to try to go through these rather slowly, but you can look them up on your list. I'm not going to refer to every one of these on your list, but one of your bone combos, which is on the first page of your list on the bottom right-hand column, is this right here. This is what is known as the zygomatic arch. I can actually hook my finger under that and pick the whole skull up. That's made up of two structures: the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now that's pretty confusing, I know, but the temporal bone has this, it's almost like a finger pointing up toward your cheekbone. Your cheekbone is the zygomatic bone. This is the zygomatic process. This little stubby finger pointing back toward the temporal bone is on the zygomatic bone. It is called the temporal process. So what I would ask here is name the structures that compose that arch, and that would be the temporal process and the zygomatic process. Also on this image, I could ask you, what is this bone? That is the zygomatic bone or cheekbone. What is this bone? It is the upper jawbone. This is the maxillary bone or maxilla. It has a structure listed under it, which is this little ridge here that holds the teeth. That is called the alveolar process, also known as the alveolar margin, sometimes called the alveolar ridge. And then this is the nasal bone. So again, we have the components of the zygomatic arch, which are the temporal process and the zygomatic process, the zygomatic bone, nasal bone, maxilla, and alveolar margin or alveolar ridge. That would be all I would ask on that diagram. But we have another picture of that, a little closer view. Here we don't see the zygomatic arch as well, but we certainly see the zygomatic bone, the maxilla, the nasal bone, the alveolar margin or ridge, or process also is known as. Any one of those would be correct. Okay, moving on. This is a picture with the top of the skull off, the top of the skull or calvaria, skull cap, and we're looking down into that. This one's a little, you have to hallucinate a little bit, but even looking at the picture, you should be able to tell that this is kind of, there's kind of a scooped out area right here. In fact, we call this, it almost looks like a saddle. And what sits in that saddle is the pituitary gland, which is a question I could ask. I could say, what structure is protected by this structure here? And that is the pituitary gland. The structure itself is known as the sella turcica, which will be on your list there under the sphenoid bone as well. And that is, sella turcica means Turkish saddle. And so that pituitary gland rides in that saddle and it protects it. So name the structure, sella turcica. What is protected by it is the pituitary gland. Okay, going on here. Now again, we have another picture of the bottom of the skull. Here we can see all 5 structures that I'm going to ask you, or I could ask you. I already went through these. These are the temporal processes, or I'm sorry, the palatine processes, palatine bones. That's 2 of the 5. We saw a probe sitting in one of these, so I would not ask you the structure here, but this is the mandibular fossa. That's 3 of the 5. Then we have this giant hole here, which is actually in Latin is called the foramen magnum, which means hole that is big. So the foramen magnum, and on each side of that, you have these little raised processes here. These are called the, or raised humps here. These are called the occipital condyles. And those actually will fit right down into your first vertebra. That's what's significant about them. So all 5 things are represented there. I would not ask you these because there's no probe in them. I could ask you those. Name these, the bones that make up the hard palate. I could ask you this or those. So foramen magnum, occipital condyles, palatine bones, palatine processes. Okay, let's go on. I'm going rather quickly because these videos, which by the way, I will send you a link to, I'll send you a link to a video on YouTube, and it takes quite a while to upload these, so I'm trying to be a little quick here today. All right, sometimes I will just ask you to name this bone. This is the mandible, lower jaw bone, but it does have some other structures listed. It has also an alveolar margin, ridge or process. It has a body, which I don't hardly ever ask, hint, hint, a ramus. It has a condyle. The condyle is what actually sits in the mandibular fossa that we saw earlier. And the condyle and the mandibular fossa, kind of like a rounded eminence in a process here, forms the temporomandibular joint. But again, that's the mandible, alveolar margin, process, condyle, or process, ridge, or and this is the condyle. Okay, moving on here. Great picture of the top of the skull. We see one of the sutures which separates the two parietal bones. This is called the sagittal suture. If you remember our planes and sections, it is in the sagittal plane, which divides into right and left portions. So this is a parietal bone, and that is a parietal bone. So I could ask either one of those or the sagittal suture on that view. I would say any questions, but I don't think I would get a response. All right, this is a fetal skull. Actually, it's a facsimile fetal skull. It's not real. If it was, I wouldn't put it on the test. But hopefully you can see, hallucinate with me, there's a little diamond shape here. And that diamond shape I will outline on the test with a color, black, red, or something. That is what we call a fontanelle. That is the anterior fontanelle, is also known as the bregma, B-R-E-G-M-A. That's on your list. Do not put soft spot for that. I'll mark it wrong, even though that's what we call it in slang terms. That is anterior fontanelle or bregma. Okay, moving along. Okay, here's the foot. There's a couple bones on here that are on your list. I didn't make you know a lot of these bones in the ankle or the wrist, but a couple of them in the ankle. The talus, right here, very important bone. We'll talk about that maybe never, because we won't maybe meet again on this. This is the calcaneus. Those are amongst the bones known as tarsal bones, but I want you to know the talus, T-A-L-U-S on your list, and the calcaneus. These are metatarsals. Now, make that distinction between the foot and the hand. We call them metacarpals in the hand. We call them carpals in the wrist. These are tarsals and metatarsals. So these are metatarsals, and then these are all the phalanges. I'm not going to talk any more about the phalanges in the foot. We'll save that for the hand. And here is the hand. Okay, I love this picture. I had the skeleton's hand sitting on the desk, but then I saw these bones were all upside down through here, but we can make it work. So what you have here, this is the metacarpals, the bones of the palm. And then each finger has a proximal, a middle, and distal phalange, or you can sometimes call those a phalanx, except for the thumb. Here's the metacarpal, the first metacarpal. Here's the proximal phalange and the distal phalange. So the thumb is an exception to that rule. So what do you think I might ask you on this? To name one of these three bones right here. That will tell me that you know the thumb does not have a middle phalange. All right, let's go on. And these are all on your list. You can mark the ones off that we don't go over. Okay, this is probably one of the, it's not hard because I'm going to tell you what it is. This is the elbow joint. This is the humerus coming down. This is the ulna. This is the radius. There's two items on this that I ask. Either you have a big depression here or you have a hump here. The hump is actually your elbow. When you flex your arm, what you think of as your elbow is this structure right here. That's called the olecranon process. When you straighten your arm, you don't feel an elbow. So what happens, the olecranon process hides in this fossa, and we call it the olecranon fossa. These are on your list under ulna, and humerus. Olecranon fossa is the depression. Olecranon process is the elevation. So those are the only two things I would ask you on that picture. Okay, let's go on here. I probably won't even use this diagram, but if I do, we can see the sacrum and the coccyx here. And I probably won't use that, so I'm going to skip on through that. We have another image of that anyway. Okay, if you've studied this at all, and this is going to tie some lecture information in. We have 3 classifications for the ribs. You can kind of look at this. This is also in your lab sheet. The first 7 pair of ribs are called true because they have an attachment to your sternum, a direct attachment. The next 3 pair are called true, and they're also called vertebrosternal. That's a big long word, but that means it attaches to the vertebra in the back and the sternum in the front. It's that simple. The next 3 pair, which are pair 8, 9, and 10, attach to the vertebra in the back, and then they hitch a ride with the cartilage in the front of number 7. All their cartilages come together and hook on the cartilage of number 7 because no rib actually attaches to the sternum by a bone-to-bone connection. That would be too painful. It attaches by a costal cartilage, which we talked about was hyaline cartilage in chapter 5 and in the tissue study. So 8, 9, and 10 are called false or vertebrochondral because they attach to the vertebra in the back, cartilage in the front, and the chondro is cartilage, so vertebrochondral. The last 2 pair are called simply vertebral because they only attach to the vertebra. As you can see, this one stops here, this one stops here. So they have no anterior attachment. They're also false because they don't attach directly to the sternum, and they're also called floating ribs. And some older people call them short ribs. So what would I ask on here? I would probably help you out on this. I'd probably give you choices. I would say, you know, how would you classify this rib, or how would you classify that rib? You should know how to classify them. Okay, let's go on here. Okay, hopefully if you've studied this enough, you can see that based on the sheet I gave you, that lumbar vertebra look like a moose, and that looks like a moose. So we know these are the lumbar vertebrae. So what we're looking at here is the top of your hip bone. And the hip bone has 3 portions, the ilium, the ischium, and pubis, which I'll show you a slide that you'll need to know that. But we're seeing the top of the ilium here. This is the iliac crest. And that's what I want you to know on that particular diagram. All right, moving on here. Okay, we have 3 vertebrae here. This seemed so hard when I had to learn it years ago, but it's really quite easy. But we want to know which region each one of these is from. And there's certain determining factors. If you look on your lab sheet or your list that I gave you, posted on Blackboard, you can see that the cervical has 3 holes, 1, 2, 3. It's the only one that has 3 holes. This is what makes it a cervical vertebra. The thoracic looks more like a giraffe, and the lumbar looks more like a moose, but the vertebral bodies get bigger as you go down from top to bottom because you're supporting more weight as you go down the body. So it's sort of like baby bear, mama bear, papa bear. This is the cervical, thoracic, lumbar. And I think this is on your sheet. There should be a number, how many of these you have. You have 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. So that's another way I could ask this. Which one of these is part of 7 segments in its region? That would be your cervical. Which one is part of 12? Which one is part of 5? So, simple enough. And again, use your sheet to just kind of look at this. Now here's a cervical vertebra. We have some sections on regional vertebra in your list. And one of those shows you the cervical. Again, some of the features it has is the 3 holes. But this has a feature that no other vertebra has. It has this piece sticking up here. A lot of students in the past have called that the monkey bone because they think it looks like a monkey for some reason. But that piece that sticks up is called the odontoid process, or the dens. And that is what I want you to know on this. This is on the 2nd cervical vertebra, C2 or axis. But I want you to know that is the dens. Okay, let's go on here. Another cervical vertebra that has specific features you need to know, this is the atlas, or C1. Again, 1, 2, 3 holes, it's a cervical vertebra. Atlas does not have a vertebral body. It's the only vertebra that doesn't. And it will spin around the axis like so. It pivots. And so Atlas, if you remember, was, what did he do? Hold up the world or something like that in mythology, but he was on top. Atlas means top. This hole in the middle, one of the features of vertebra, that is called a vertebral foramen. These are called transverse foramen. You do not have to know all those specialized features of a typical vertebrate, but if you know that the transverse processes are out at the side. This does not actually have a spinous process, but most vertebrae do. I'll show you. We'll go back here a second. You can see these are spinous processes. But if you just know where the body is, it's in the anterior, the spinous process is posterior, the transverse processes come off each side. That is a vertebral foramen, that is a transverse foramen. That would be good on the features of a typical vertebra, is what that is listed under. And again, I apologize for going fast, but you know, we have no choice. We got to get these on there, and this is to help you out. So hopefully reduce this. This is the right scapula. And I'm going to show you some features on this. I'm not even sure that I'll use this particular picture. We have some in the book pictures. This is the vertebral or medial border, and that's because it goes down close to the spine. When I reach back, I can feel this structure is about all I can feel on my scapula. That is the spine. You do not necessarily need to know that, but if you follow that out to the tip, the lateral side, we will see the acromion process. And if you remember your regional terms in chapter 1 on your lecture test, and also your first lab exam, that's where the acromion was the acromial region was the tip of the shoulder. We have and I usually don't ask this, axillary border, which is going up into the armpit. This is where your arm bone or your humerus is going to articulate. And the term articulate means to form a joint, so it will form a joint right there, the head of the humerus, and hang down. Let's see here. Okay, this bone is almost out of the view of the camera. When I took this picture, I think the bone actually moved, and I like to call this the devil bone because it has 2 horns on it. It's a very scary looking bone, but this is the only bone that does not form a joint with another bone. It is called the hyoid bone, and it is located right here in your throat. And it does not connect to any other bone. It has a series of ligaments and other things that hold it in there. Very important for swallowing, and this is a bone that's frequently broken when somebody strangles someone. Okay, let's go on. Okay, what we're showing here is trying to show the difference in the male and female pelvis. This is not a hard and fast rule, but it is a good, easy determinant here. A male pelvis has this angle here is called the pubic arch, because these are the pubic bones. And the pubic arch is less than 90 degrees in a male. In a female, it is greater than 90 degrees. So even though we're asking you to do a little geometry, the female's on the left, the male's on the right. I want you to know the difference in them. Female pelvis also a little wider than the male. That's just normal for childbearing. Okay, moving ahead here. Again, this is a female pelvis, greater than 90 degrees. But there's some features on here. This right here is a band of fibrocartilage. And if you remember back to chapter 5 in the tissues, we had a band of fibrocartilage here called the pubic symphysis. That is what this structure is. This is very similar structure to what we saw where the humerus articulated with the scapula, and we didn't name it there. We'll name it on another picture, but this is called the acetabulum. It's where the femur bone is going to stick. The head of the femur bone will go in there. And then down here at the bottom, you probably are sitting on this if you're seated right now. This is called the ischial tuberosity. So on this particular picture, pubic symphysis, acetabulum, ischial tuberosity. And again, you can slow this down with your phones and stuff. Okay, that's all the bony pictures. Now here's the book pictures. And I left these blank for a reason, but I do not want you to know every single structure on this. That would be cruel and unusual punishment. But let's look at what's right in the front of us here. The frontal bone. This line here, the orange bone is the frontal bone. So if I ask you to name the bone, name the entire bone. And that's a little hint when you take this on the online. Again, I'm trying to shove all the information into this little video, but if I say name the bone, that is the entire bone. If I say name the structure, that is something listed under the bone on your list, and only something I'm going over. If I have not gone over it on this little video, it won't be on there. If it is, I'll give it to you. Also, I like the nasal bones here. This line here, the greenish sage green bones there, those are the nasal bones. So that's probably good on that particular diagram, something right in the middle. Now, this particular picture in your text, this is mislabeled. It'll say something like axial skeleton. I forget what it says on it, axial skeleton or something really stupid. This should say paranasal sinuses, P-A-R-A, nasal sinuses. And each one of these you'll be responsible for. We have 4 bones that have these in it. The top line is indicating the frontal sinus. The next one is the ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, and then the maxillary sinus. These are all listed on your list, and you should know any one of those. I can just put a letter A in between and say name the structure at A. Frontal sinus, ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, maxillary sinus. All right. Next view is a lateral view of the skull. And again, if you're starting to study this is a great place to learn the skull because it's color-coded. And I would suggest that. But again, use only these structures I'm asking you to know in the diagram. On this, it's a lateral view. I still like the frontal bone here. And I like this. This is the coronal suture. This line, coronal suture. But I also, right in the center of view is the temporal bone. And on your temporal bone list, I like this structure. This is the external auditory or acoustic meatus. That is a hole through that bone. That's your ear hole. This is the mastoid process. So those 3 diagrams, those 3 pictures probably are structures. Okay, again, we're looking at the bottom of the skull here. And as such, you have, again, 5 structures that we showed you on there is all. And of those 5, there's only a couple I would want to show you here. We've shown you the hard palate on another view. You can't even see the mandibular fossa. Right there they are, and there. But the foramen magnum is actually labeled with a line here, and so is one of the occipital condyles. So occipital condyle, foramen magnum on that particular picture. This picture, I do not want you to know. This is nothing that will be on the test. However, I think in your list that I put on there, you have a little picture of the coronal view through the ethmoid bone. This pink bone is the ethmoid bone. And there are 3 structures highlighted on that coronal view. One is the cristagalli, one is the perpendicular plate, and one is the vomer bone. It's a little hand-drawn diagram that's on the 3rd page in your packet, your skeletal list. So I want you to know those for the test, and they will be exactly like they are on that diagram. I don't have that diagram in this picture file. Okay, the same structures that are on that hand-drawn diagram in your list, your skeletal list is what I'm talking about, and that is on Blackboard. I posted it the other day. And you should have an image in there of the ethmoid bone from a coronal view. And there are 3 structures to know. The same 3 structures I want you to know on a lateral view. This is the first one. This is the cristagalli, this line. This line, the next line down, this is the perpendicular plate. And then this line, going to this pink bone, is the vomer bone. The word vomer means plow. It kind of looks like a plow. So these are the same 3 structures I have highlighted in bold on that coronal view. So here we're looking at a sagittal view, and on your other list we're looking at a coronal view, and I want you to know it on both views. Okay. This again is the atlas. This is the atlas, or C1, first cervical vertebra. This line is pointing very well to the foramen, the vertebral foramen, which is through every vertebra. And then this one is pointing very well to the transverse foramen, which is what makes a cervical vertebra a cervical vertebra. So know what bone it is and know what those structures are. Again, this is C2, or axis. This little bracketed line here, that is showing you the odontoid process, or the dens. And that's what I want you to know on it again. So a lot of these structures are the same as I wanted you to know on the actual bone pictures. Now I'm not going to reduce this any in magnification. I don't know that I can. But this is probably the picture of the sacrum I would use if I want it. We see the sacrum here, the coccyx here. And many times on a test I may just say how many bones fuse to form the larger of the two bones shown here. If you look on your list, this is 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fused vertebra. The coccyx is anywhere from, I think we say 3 to 4. In this case, it's 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the larger of the two bones here is the sacrum, and it is from the fusion of 5 bones. Very simple question and answer there. Okay, real quickly, I'm going to go through the classification of the ribs. I do not know if I'll use this diagram. If I do, I'll use it for the parts of the breastbone, which is also known as the mandible. The sternum. The first part of that, it's in 3 parts. It's called the manubrium. This is the body, and then this is the xiphoid process, which actually begins with the letter X. And that is a landmark for CPR. If you're doing CPR, you find that, you go 2 finger widths above, and then you put the heel of your hand above that, which obviously this is not to scale. But this bracket is showing you all the true ribs, or vertebrosternal ribs. This bigger bracket is showing you all the false ribs. This bracket is showing you rib number 8, 9, and 10. 8, 9, and 10, which are vertebrochondral and also false. And then this little line is showing you the 2 floating, or vertebral ribs as we call them. So that is the classification. I will probably not ask you about classification on this particular diagram, only the parts of the sternum. All right. Okay, sometimes I will just ask you with this line to name this bone. This bone is the humerus. Not as funny as it might sound, but this is the humerus bone. This is the head of the humerus sticking into the scapula here. This is the clavicle. The clavicle is the most frequently broken bone in the body. That's a good little tidbit to know. So I would know about the clavicle, know this is the humerus on that diagram. This is the scapula. This is the medial or vertebral border. This is the axillary border. That is the acromion process. The same thing I showed you on the other one. This line is actually pointing into what we call the glenoid cavity. But this is where the humerus, the head of the humerus, is going to articulate. In fact, we just saw that. Let me go back one slide here. Here is the head of the humerus articulating in that glenoid cavity. But the only place to really see that, this is also called the glenoid fossa on your list, is on a lateral view. This is the lateral view of the scapula. So this is the glenoid fossa or glenoid cavity. Here's the acromion process up here. But that is where the humerus is going to articulate. That's what I want you to know. Glenoid cavity, glenoid fossa right there. This is the humerus. Nothing up here I'm going to ask. This is the head of the humerus. It's pretty easy. We have some structures up there that I'm not going to ask, and don't ask me why, but I'll show you the ones down here. This one that sticks up very largely here, this is called the medial epicondyle. The one here in these views is the lateral epicondyle. Now each one of these pictures that you see of the appendages is the same side. This is a right humerus, as if I'm standing in anatomical position looking at you. This is a right humerus, the posterior view. So this is an anterior right humerus, this is a posterior right humerus. I'm not asking you to know which side it is, but it will help you identify these structures. The head of this bone always points to the midline. So this is pointing to the middle, that's why it's the medial condyle. This is the lateral condyle. This is where we get tennis elbow out here at the lateral epicondyle. I'm sorry, I said condyle. Medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. Okay, this is the radius and ulna, and I just simply want you to know which bone is which. Again, this is a right arm. The thumb side bone is the radius. So in anatomical position, this is on the thumb side, this is on the little finger side, this is the radius, this is the ulna. Just know the difference in them. Okay, here's your hand. These are carpals. This bracket is showing carpals. The wrist bones, I'm not asking you to name those individually. These are metacarpals. These are numbered starting with the thumb. This is the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth digit. But these are metacarpals. And then these are phalanges. And we have the same rules we saw in the other picture, the actual bone simulated picture. We have 3 phalanges or phalanxes in each finger except for the thumb. We only have a proximal and distal. And I want you to know that rule again. So basically you have 14 phalanges per hand or foot. The foot has the same rules. It has 3 phalanges in every digit except for the big toe. So we have 14 phalanges per hand or foot. This structure, probably the best thing here is this line is pointing right to the pubic symphysis, and that's probably what I use. And this looks like a male pelvis. This is a hip bone. There are 3 parts to the hip bone. If I ask you what the bone colored portion is, that's the ilium. The reddish portion is the pubis, and the green portion is the ischium. So know the different parts. They say that is 3 bones that fuse to form one. This is the femur. And again, this is a right femur, sorry. I will say this real quick, that the femur, this is the head, this is the surgical neck, and the surgical neck is where you actually find a hip fracture. And this particular part is broken, so it's not really a fracture of the hip, it's a fracture of the thigh bone. Sorry, I don't know what I did there, but we got way out of sorts. So let's get back to where we're at here. Okay, looking at the bottom of the femur, there's a couple structures here. You have to turn it posteriorly. So again, this is an anterior view, this is a posterior view. Medial condyle, lateral condyle. Again, in the humerus we had epicondyles, these are condyles. Medial condyle, lateral condyle. Okay, the tibia and fibula. Certainly I want you to know the names of these 2 bones. These are the most often mixed up bones in the body. Again, the tibia is the more medial of the bones. This is a right leg again. So this is the more medial bone. This is the more lateral. This is tibia. This is fibula. So know the difference in them. This is the medial condyle, lateral condyle of the tibia. This is the tibial tuberosity. We normally would talk about, you can get something called jumper's knee there. Then down on the distal part, what you feel is the inside of your ankle that feels smooth. This is the medial malleolus, lateral malleolus. So all those particular structures I pointed out there, was about 5 of them, I think. Then here's another picture of the foot. If I ask anything here, it would be the calcaneus or the talus. Likely will not ask that. And I'm not going to use this last diagram at all. So hopefully that will narrow it down for you. This will be on a schedule. I just put an announcement on it, so whatever class you're in, look for your schedule when I'm going to put this on here. Hopefully very soon I'll figure out how to put them on and let you work ahead and still keep the integrity of the class. So if you have any questions, email me, but this was designed to really narrow down that list for you. So if I didn't say it on one of these structures, don't study it. And that's the end. I'll talk to you all later. Thank you.